Hello and welcome to today's module, Psychological Skills Training, Arousal Regulation. We want to be able to optimize your arousal to perform your best. The source for this information comes out of our required textbook, our Weinberg and Gold, Foundations of Sport and Exercise Psychology, 7th edition. Our learning objectives for this module are that we'll be able to identify and describe popular arousal theories, discuss arousal influence on attentional field, identify broad arousal regulation techniques, and then be able to discuss some specific arousal reduction and inducing techniques. Let's first take a look at some of the popular theories around arousal. We've already discussed social facilitation theory. In this module, we'll also discuss the drive theory, inverted U hypothesis, individual zone of optimum functioning, known as eyes-off, reversal theory, as well as the catastrophe phenomenon. Let's revisit social facilitation theory. Now, this theory predicts that with the presence of others or an audience, it will perform better than if we were to perform that task alone, and especially when the task is well learned or it's a simple task. But this theory also predicts that when we haven't learned the task very well, that the audience or doing the task with others will actually inhibit or lessen our performance. So again, it's important to understand that social facilitation theory on performance and arousal will indicate that it can be debilitative or facilitative based on the individual's perceived ability, the task complexity, and if the situation is evaluative or not. The next theory we want to familiarize ourselves with is the drive theory. Now, this theory really helps us see the relationship between arousal and performance with a linear relationship. This theory indicates and can predict that if an individual's arousal is really high, that they would have an extremely high performance. Well, this theory does not have a lot of scientific backing, and the research would suggest that this theory does not actually even hold true. Although this theory is traditionally accepted in aggressive sports like football and boxing, and why you may see the pregame speech be a very highly volatile, emotionally charged speech to try to induce that arousal to improve performance. But we do know that short-lived heightened arousal will not hold for the entire game. So it's important to understand that this drive theory, although it is kind of an old school way of looking at things, is not a driving theory for how we want to view arousal in today's sporting environment. A more popular view is the inverted U hypothesis. Now, this theory predicts that everyone performs best at a midpoint range of arousal. As you can see from the graph there, on the bottom edge of the graph, there's the pressure of the situation. There's either low pressure or high pressure. So that's where your anxiety will be either low or high. And then you can see as you get to the middle part of that pressure, there's optimum stress that we perform best under according to this hypothesis. And so with this hypothesis, it's helpful to help us understand that we do have a need to be in a zone of optimal arousal. Now, most athletes and coaches accept this as a general notion. I mean, after all, most people have experienced being under-aroused, having optimal arousal, or being over-aroused. Now, think about the last time you experienced that. When you're under-aroused, you feel boredom. When you're over-aroused, you have too much anxiety. And when you're optimally aroused, you feel as though you can perform your best. However, critics do question this theory, and they question the shape of the curve and whether or not everybody performs at the midpoint of arousal, which leads us to our next theory. The next theory is the individual zone of optimal functioning, known as the eyes-off. Now, this theory contends that optimal arousal is individualized to the performer and even to the sport, and that optimal arousal is not always at a midpoint. And actually, they contend in this theory that arousal is more of a bandwidth within each emotion that we experience during competition. And so this is based on an athlete's perception of that emotion. We can see emotions as either being pleasant or unpleasant. But even some of the pleasant emotions that we feel may actually negatively impact our behavior or our performance. And conversely, there are unpleasant emotions that may actually positively impact our performance. For instance, take a look at this eyes-off chart. Now, this is of a hypothetical individual, but notice that there is 3 distinct parts to this graph. There's the dysfunctional negative emotions. There are the optimal emotions that have both a negative and a positive viewpoint of. And then there's the dysfunctional positive emotions. And as you take a look at the emotions down at the bottom part of the graph, you'll see things on the dysfunctional negative emotions that are traditionally viewed as dysfunctional or negative emotions, such as being uncomfortable, being dispirited or frustrated or nervous, right? On the other end of the graph, you see dysfunctional positive emotions, things of being comfortable or overconfident or content, maybe even dispassionate. Those, according to this and to this individual, those positive emotions are actually debilitative to performance. Now let's take a look at the optimal emotions, both the negative and positive. So sometimes we get concerned that we feel uneasy or that we're scared or intimidated. Those feelings and emotions can actually be a positive or have a positive effect on our performance if we can view them in the right way. Now, in the optimal emotions on the positive side, you can see that this individual found that fun, being pleased, feeling confident and excited actually were both positive emotions and positively correlated to their performance. What's most important to understand is that the best performance occurs when you have optimal level of state anxiety and other emotions, whether they are traditionally looked at as negative or positive. So again, remember there are 3 categories of emotions that we look at in the eyes-off: dysfunctional negative emotions, dysfunctional positive emotions, and then the optimal emotions that can be both negative or positive from a traditional sense. Now, being able to devise an eyes-off requires discussing emotions with individual athletes to determine if they believe the emotion is optimal, facilitative, or dysfunctional, debilitative, regardless of being traditionally perceived as a negative or positive emotion. Then you have the athletes rate their perception of each of these emotions. Then they are plotted on a graph like this to create a bandwidth of which the emotions will enable them to perform their best and which ones will hinder their performance. And within that bandwidth, you'll notice that the individual will rate it at the rating between 0 and 10, and that each one has about a 3-point variation between the top end of that emotion and the bottom of the end of it. It's critical to remember that this theory is highly individualized to the participant. And in one case, an athlete may find an emotion to be optimal, whether it be a negative or positive emotion, and another athlete will find that same emotion to be a dysfunctional, either positive or negative emotion. So again, the eyes-off was developed to help us realize that we as individuals have different needs, and it's very sport dependent and personality dependent. Another arousal theory is the reversal theory. Now, this has everything to do with an individual's interpretation of arousal as being facilitative or debilitative. Now, this ties into the eyes-off, but actually really deals with more of how an individual interprets the moment-to-moment changes within an event. In one moment, maybe the beginning of the event, you feel calm, you feel relaxed, you feel excited, you're ready for everything. But then as the game carries on and the outcome becomes more uncertain, now you may begin to feel more stress and arousal. Now, if you feel in that moment that stress and arousal is being more debilitative than the stress and arousal at the beginning of the game, now you're going to interpret that in a way that will be debilitative to your performance. Now, an individual They get into a highly pressurized situation at the end of the game, such as a game-winning situation where they need to make the last free throw or kick a penalty shot to win the game. And they interpret that stress and anxiety as being facilitated because they've practiced it. Their perceived competence is very high. So again, this is important to understand that we have control, that the performer has control of a situation in the way they interpret it. And so this goes back and relates all the way back to coping skills and the need for improving coping skills in moments of high pressure and high competitiveness. So the key point to this is that how a performer interprets arousal will influence their overall performance and behavior. The last theory we want to review is the catastrophe phenomenon. Now, this is a complex theory and it deals with complex interactions of arousal and cognitive anxiety. Now, it indicates that when you have low cognitive anxiety, the performance is going to more be related to the inverted U hypothesis. However, if someone has high cognitive anxiety, as arousal increases, it will hit a threshold. And it's at that threshold that there is a rapid decline in performance. And once you hit that point, it is nearly impossible to recover from. We see this in all levels of athletics, from youth athletics all the way up to the professional levels. When you see behaviors of a competitor start to change, the body language, their self-talk, their reaction to adversity, you can oftentimes tell and predict they are entering that catastrophe phenomenon. And it's important to understand that this catastrophe phenomenon relates back to having good coping mechanisms. If we have good coping mechanisms, we'll be able to avoid this catastrophe phenomenon. It's when we have the poor somatic and cognitive anxiety coping skills that we find ourselves in a situation under high pressure and not being able to recover to perform as we should. In addition to understanding different theories on arousal, it's important to understand how arousal influences our attentional field. Think about a time when you were overly aroused. Where did your attention go? Did it get really broad or did it get really narrow? Research indicates that when we have too much arousal and state anxiety, it leads to muscle tension and fatigue, which interferes with the coordination of movement. It narrows our focus and decreases our environmental scanning. Our attention, concentration, and visual search are also affected by arousal levels. When we are under-aroused, we have too broad of a visual search. We take in a bunch of irrelevant cues, therefore missing the relevant cues. On the contrary, when we get over-aroused, you find that our focus narrows and we miss relevant cues. So what we really are looking for is that optimal or moderate arousal. We need to be able to regulate our arousal with good coping skills to keep us in that zone of optimal functioning. So we take in the right cues. We're only taking in relevant cues. We're in the moment and we're present. And we make good decisions when we are in that zone. So before we put this all together, let's take a minute to recap some of these things. First off, arousal is multifaceted and complex. It consists of both psychological activation and an athlete's interpretation of that activation. That deals with state anxiety, confidence, understanding or thinking about it as facilitative or debilitative arousal. And this is individualized and task dependent. Then the individual also has their self-confidence and perception of control that they're dealing with. And again, that'll determine if an event is facilitative or debilitative. Optimal cognitive and somatic arousal levels are not necessarily the same, right? You might be highly aroused, but that doesn't mean that you have high anxiety. And you may be highly aroused on a somatic level, but cognitively, you're calm, cool, and collected. So it's important that we understand that being an individual and individual situations are unique and that we can't always put them all into the same category or make a cookie cutter definition for everything. Now, it's doubtful that our optimal levels of arousal occur at a midpoint. Looking at the research, IZOF is more well developed in its understanding of how we work as an individual with our personality, how we view subjectively the emotions that occur during a competitive event. And that differs from that inverted U hypothesis where it's everybody kind of fits into the same mold. And so we understand, and hopefully understand by now, that we as individuals do not fit into the same mold. So it's important that we understand that the eyes off is a better method of helping individuals to identify the emotions that help and hinder their performance. And lastly, the research indicates that we need to have well-practiced coping skills, self-talk, imagery, goal setting, routines, and even making sure we have good time management and sleep, and are critical for us becoming 1% better every day. So before we conclude this module, let's introduce you to a few arousal regulation techniques. Well, the main thing is that we have to understand there are somatic anxiety reduction techniques, cognitive anxiety reduction techniques, and arousal-inducing techniques. Okay, now there's a myriad of somatic anxiety reduction techniques, but we're going to talk about two in this module. The first one is progressive relaxation. Now this essentially is tense and relaxing of muscles. Now this could be tensing and relaxing of a single muscle group, or it could be something where you tense and relax the whole body. Now generally speaking, this begins with a tightening of the muscle group or progressively tightening from one area, such as the feet, all the way up to the head in a systematic way, and holding that tension for 10 to 15 seconds and holding that breath. And then before you release the tension, you take a big deep breath in and then relax it out. Now, another somatic anxiety reduction technique is breath control. Now, there's things such as deep belly breathing and box breathing, which will be found in your supplemental resources of this module. But essentially, breathing control helps us regulate our heart rate and the somatic response to stress and anxiety. It's a critical element of us helping regain control of our thoughts and our actions. Let's now take a look at cognitive anxiety reduction techniques. Well, we're actually going to just take a look at one. Now, there are, again, multiple cognitive anxiety reduction techniques, but one that is easily implemented and can be done just about anywhere is the relaxation response. Now, this requires that you find a quiet place with minimal or no distractions, no extra stimuli to keep you from being mindful. You need to be able to sit in a comfortable position. Then you need to use a mental device. Focus on a single thought or word and repeat it. That word should be something that helps you calm down. It could be a color or a phrase or just something that allows you to be passive in your attitude. You need to be able to let thoughts come in, because as much as you'd like to think like you could be mindful and not think of anything, when you sit down to relax in this relaxation response, we often have a bunch of thoughts coming into our head. And we need to be able to allow those thoughts to come in, but not attend to them, not focus on any of the thoughts, but just keep repeating the mantra or the mental device, the focal words and singular thoughts that we're trying to repeat in our heads, and focus on that to allow that brain to slow down. Let all the unnecessary thoughts bubble up and then release them. This technique can be done in just a matter of minutes, or you can take 20, 30, 40 minutes to do a cognitive anxiety reduction technique of relaxation response. Lastly, we want to talk about arousal-inducing techniques. Now, so far we've basically focused on anxiety management and techniques to reduce excess levels of anxiety. However, there are times when we actually need to get more energized, where we need to bring up that arousal so that way we are more able to meet the challenges. And with that, we can do certain things. We can act energized. We can hop and bounce around. You see this with athletes regularly. They get out of a timeout. They were just sitting for maybe a minute. And so they get up and they bounce around and they get excited. They act energized. That can help us. Mood words and statements. These need to be energizing and activating. They can be something such as, if you're a swimmer, you can be thinking of the fastest fish you know, or a dolphin, or a swordfish. If you want to be aggressive, you can think about being a wrecking ball. Those are mood words or statements that you're using that are energizing and activating. Another way to induce arousal is to yell and shout, the team cheer, right? You see that a lot. And the All Blacks are notorious for their haka before the game, and that helps them get energized. That brings up that arousal level, and allows them to get in the zone. Or you can just have get excited after a good play. It's okay to pat yourself on the back from time to time and get excited about doing something well. So yelling and shouting is another way to induce arousal. Lastly, listening to music. The research is out there that there is music that's more calming than others. So you got to find the type of music that induces the energy in you. But typically, it needs to be energizing music. And this is something that's going to be highly personal. But I think every one of us, if you ever watch pre-games of any kind of sporting event, you will notice nearly every athlete out there has their headphones on. They're finding a way to get in the zone with music. So again, it's another way to have a pre-game routine to help you get in the right mood, have the right arousal, and be able to perform your best. Please go back and review the learning objectives for this module. Thank you for your time, energy, and effort in completing this module. Please let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day. Go Beach.